problems at play. So there are multiple issues kind of at play here. For example, there are issues of provision of education. So for example, for developing economies, the ideal is to reach at least 4% of the overall GDP contribution of the country for education, whereas in Pakistan, it's only 2.3 percent. So investment problems, but at the same time, there has been a lot of political unrest in the country in terms of, suicide attacks and bombings because of the war on terror, because Pakistan lies in the border with Afghanistan, right? So all of that brunt of that war has been taken by this country. And so what has happened is consequentially, a lot of schools, girls' schools, have been targeted by militants. And as a result, the sort of already limited access to education has become even more sort of limited for girls in Pakistan. So these and other issues around, economic instability, around some of the sort of regressive cultural practices as well, but more importantly, the issues around multidimensional poverty. So things around, if you are poor, that just doesn't mean that you're financially poor. There are intersectionalities there, that then, expand or limit your opportunities for life. So many other things are actually happening there. And as a result, even though now that we hear in a lot of development kind of talk, and we hear that a lot of countries, even from the developing economies, have been able to close that gender gap in education in terms of access. But now there's more discussion about quality and, how the environment of schooling is for girls. Unfortunately for Pakistan, access still is a very big issue. So we still do not have, all the girls are not going to school. A lot of them are actually out of schools at the moment. So this access and quality related issues are quite intermingled. And this is a big issue. The government has made repeated sort of like commitments towards education, but it doesn't seem to be solving. And that is what enticed me to kind of start exploring more. But I also wanted to know, what were the workings, what were the processes, what were the systems, and what were the intersections between these multidimensional ways in which, disadvantage was affecting girls to for Pakistan to be in this situation. So when I looked at the literature, there was literature out there, and indeed literature was telling us that there was a connection, some kind of a relationship between mothers and their daughters' education. For example, there were certain studies, again, using human capital kind of perspectives,
Yes.
quantitative methods, other studies looking at, how mothers and their education levels, for example, the number of years of schools that they had completed, how that was having a relationship with their daughter's education, a positive one, which meant that if you were a mother and you had spent more years at school, there was a higher likelihood that your daughter would be enrolled at school and she would probably be doing well. So statistics like that, numbers like that were already out there. There were more statistics around, things about women's autonomy, for example, measured through decision making power and other measures which are quite controversial now, and we might not agree with those, but those are also leading to this kind of connection between the mothers and daughters. So we knew, upon assumptions that, certain investment in the education of mother would lead to, outcomes for daughters, but the process was still a black box, so not much was known of the process. And so the question for me was basically, how does it work? How does that communication work? And if you look at the other literature, especially in the global south, you would notice that there is a lot of literature that talks about this special relationship between mothers and daughters in the sense of a shared gendered experience of living. And so therefore this connection in the northern kind of literature, it's sometimes taken as a very abrasive one, but at certain points in time it becomes a more of a supportive one. But there is more literature to say that there is some connection based on shared gendered experiences amongst these generations. But all of those discussions and debates were actually kind of watered down by these statistics to say that, just by virtue of remaining in school for X number of years, you would actually be able to have an effect. So what was the process? That black box was what enticed me. So the question that I asked, the overall question was, how do mothers influence their daughters' education in rural Pakistan? And most definitely the emphasis was on how. So what is the process? How does it actually happen? Now, here is where the kind of like the problematization of the human capital kind of collided with the kind of topic that I wanted to look at and understand. Because if like you all must know that one of the critiques on the human capital perspective is that it doesn't engage with the processes. And also it comes with the assumption that the human being is going to be a rational decision maker, investing in the right kinds of investments, bearing in mind that there's a perfect market condition, and all of these things are going to materialize automatically. Now, that doesn't kind of work out in the context where you're trying to, for example, look at mothers and their efforts for their daughters, where you may see that mothers might actually not be seeing any kind of opportunities, income opportunities around them, but at the same time they might be saying, but I want my daughter to go to school, and I'm willing to work like very hard in 50 degrees heat in a brick kiln, to like work hard, be engaged in manual labor, so that I can make a little bit of money and I can provide that education to my daughter. I mean, even if the schools are free, the state schools are free, they have to pay for uniforms and other accessories. So where does that leave me then? For example, if what about altruism, which cannot be explained by the human capital theory, because literally there is no translation of that investment into an outcome in terms of a flourishing economy, for example. So that is where the questions started emerging. And so I'm not going to go into greater detail into the capabilities approach, but I just want this to be there to then kind of like talk about two key critiques that were actually that actually made me turn towards the capability approach. The reason why I talk about human capital is because within that background of research, even mothers' efforts were conceptualized as a human capital. And so a lot of literature that was coming out was also drawing on the human capital theory to conceptualize education, because that is the most even now this is the mostly used kind of framework in order to assess the investments in education, intergenerationally or otherwise as well. So now one of the key critiques, like I mentioned before, was that there was no emphasis on the process, and therefore that remained as a black box. But the second important thing that actually made me turn towards that was the distinction that the capability theorists call the means ends distinction. So, for example, when we talk about development, the human capital theory would insist that a certain investment in the human capital would result in a productive workforce, and therefore help the economy of the country, and the country would flourish. So from this kind of definition, the human beings are actually the means through which that health of the economy can actually be achieved. So then a progressing economy, a country doing well, is actually the ends. Now, what the capability approach actually did was it flipped the coin, and it said that actually, instead of going this way around, you come that way over. And what you're now thinking, and what countries and states and development researchers should actually be thinking about, is that economy, not the only one, but also one of the important things for development, along with health, education, and other indicators, that is should be the means through which we come back and we see how human beings can be benefited. How is it that people can achieve their flourishings, they can achieve their well-being, but at the same time, coming from that end where the economy actually serves the purpose, it becomes the means, and the human beings become the end. Now, this one point is extremely crucial, because if you translate it back to my own study, I was interested in how mothers, what were they doing? What were the processes? What was the black box? And it wasn't as simple as putting them in school and giving them 3-4 years of education, right? There was something else more powerful happening there. There was a transformation happening in a context where there was political upheaval, where there was economic issues and problems, there were cultural issues as well, multidimensional poverty at play as well. So what was happening there? So with the help of then the capability approach, actually in development, the attention altogether suddenly moves back to the person, the people, and they become the ends that we should be concerning about, and we should be caring about. So what the approach then says is that, and then but what do we mean when we say that the attention comes to the human being? The approach actually says that the aim of any state or any development actor or practitioner or researcher should be to ensure that people have the amount of freedoms to achieve the things that they value in life. And it's the beings and doings and the other vocabulary within the capability literature. But do you understand the emphasis not only fell on the people, but actually fell on what they want, we were now made to think about what are the needs and wants of these people, this population, these women, these elderly indigenous people, LGBTQ community. What are the needs of these people that they want from life so that they can achieve that flourishing, and how do we reach there? And then we were thinking that, how can economy help in that? How can education help in that? How can healthcare help in that? How can countries, us as development researchers, help to conceptualize that? So with that perspective, then that gave me a very nice kind of sort of springboard to begin with. So if you don't, I've just encircled the key ideas that I'll be talking about with respect to my research. But if you look at that, it was basically the idea that people may want certain achievements, right? They achieve by achievements, they might want to be in certain conditions, or they want to achieve certain things in life, right? And people have a different set of resources. They could have financial resources, they could have non-market, market, net income, all of those things combined together. But every person has a different ability of converting this resource into what they want in life. So for example, for a girl who owns a bicycle in a rural community where it's frowned upon for women to ride bikes, what purpose does that resource have for that girl? Nothing. She can't, she wanted to ride the bike, she can't ride it. So the approach, actually what it did was, very effectively, it looked at the process of that conversion. How do we talk about these different things that people have in life so that they can achieve what they want in life, right? And so the role of a state is then to make sure that everybody has equal amount of opportunities and freedoms to achieve the things that they want in life with the resources that they have. Now, it could be that a person who has to use a wheelchair for communication and reaching somewhere, another person who is able-bodied, the same amount of resources would not benefit both of them, right? They won't be able to reach an X spot with the same amount of resources. The person who has to use other assisted things would need more support, right? So that was beside the point. The point was everybody should have equal opportunities to kind of achieve these things. Now, if you transport this whole idea into my study and my research, for me, what was essential and a way to understand was, if the mothers themselves wanted their daughters to achieve education, if they wanted their daughters to receive education, what were the resources that they had access to? What was their social context? What was the personal history and psychology, the choice, and all of the other vectors? But for me, the the quest was to understand, if they wanted their daughters to receive education, what was happening there? How much freedom did they actually have? What were the constraints they were living under? And within that kind of debate, try to understand what was happening. So the way that I kind of use that, because how do I find out, like, how do I bring that framework to life for these particular mothers that I'm talking about? I drew on the concept of aspirations. Now, aspirations is an interesting one, because with aspirations, I asked, like I said, I collected stories. I asked them what aspirations did they have for their daughter's education, and they would tell me about all sorts of things. And I encouraged them to tell me their stories, to talk about their past, present, future, all of those things. And in telling me those stories, then they talked about what they had in mind, what aspirations they had. And they also talked about the different actions that they performed every single day, constantly, to achieve those aspirations. Now, why is it that I used aspirations and not, for example, goals or achievements or outcomes, for example, that they had in mind? Because a lot of times in constrained circumstances, when you have to you have economic constraints on you, you have cultural constraints, other constraints on you, then you can have dreams and hopes, but you can't make concrete plans, because practically speaking, you don't have the environment is not ripe for you to achieve those kind of gains. So what aspirations did for me is that it gave me that fluid, that soft cloud within which women's dreams and their fantasies and their vague ideas, their concrete ambitions and goals about their daughter's education could actually be shared with me through the different stories that they told. So what this helped me to do was, I wasn't just like the promise from the capability perspective, I wasn't focused on just the outcome to see, I have 5 mothers, 2 of them, their daughters go to school, so this is a success story, I'm going to talk about that. But I could actually also focus on those who were making these efforts, who were holding these aspirations, but because of other things, their aspirations were actually not being achieved. But at the same time, if they made efforts every day, did they count for nothing? They were very valuable because through those actions, through those different actions that they performed, they were showing their agency, they were showing their power, the glimmer in their eyes when they talked about little things that they did to make things possible, even if at the end it didn't achieve the same goal. These were actions, these were power, shows of power that women were actually able to do. And that meant something, that had value. Why did it have value? Because, the approach allowed me to look at the individuals and their efforts, and the individual was key for me in the whole study. So just to give you a background of the sort of the sample size, etc. So I basically interviewed 30 families, and within these 30 families, there were mothers. I interviewed daughters, and then household heads of those families, any elderly that were present, in like a grandfather, grandmother, who would also be decision makers, those. And then I also interviewed if they had a son. So one of the sons I also interviewed. And I basically, the interviews were drawing on the capability approach and the different elements that are there within it. And then, so it was a qualitative study, and I did a thematic and narrative analysis. The narration or the narrative part helped me to then account for the time. So past, present, and future efforts of mothers, and then also for the space, the structural space, the physical space that they were living in, and the social interaction. So all of those elements could be brought together in this kind of analysis and framework. But the focus was always the mother's efforts and what they were able and not able to do. Now, these are the very simple kind of few findings that I thought would be related with this. So I'm going to discuss them. But not surprisingly, so there were 50% of the mothers had actually been to school in my sample, and 50 had never been to school. And all across the board, all of them saw value in education and wanted to send their daughters in school. So had I not gone with an open aspiration kind of perspective, then I would have been limited to, concrete plans, who is able to make them, and only include them in these discussions. Whereas all across the board, they all had aspirations for their daughter's education. And a lot of them were actually very concretely had like literally plans, and they were like, this is what I'm doing, I've done in the past, this didn't work, so I'm going to try this in the future. My younger one is quite young now, there's a school opening in the vicinity. So all of those concrete plans were constantly, they were happening there, and they were constantly on the move with these kind of ideas. And they were doing, like I said, actions every day, every bit of the day. Some were successful, some were not successful, some led to bigger gains, some did not lead to any gains, but constantly they were working. So was there no power in this working, in this strategizing, in this making, trying to make things happen? There is definitely some amount of speaking back to power that was happening there, right? And so another important and interesting thing actually that came out was this element. So mother said, when I said, why do you want to, why do you support your daughter's education, where you've said that there aren't any opportunities for employment in your rural community, people have high education and still they're not finding any jobs, why are you doing that? And so a lot of them like repeated certain things, which translated to, my daughter will have choice, my daughter will have freedom, my daughter will have independence. And this freedom and independence had nothing to do with the liberative politics that we talk about, the liberation and the freedom. Those weren't those grand ideas. And when I asked them more, they talked about that choice of being somebody else, that one choice that allowed them to not have the only future that a lot of them would have if they had never been to school. And I still remember there was a life-changing event when I was talking to one of the mothers, and she actually held my hand and she put her own hand right next to mine. And she said, these are the hardened hands of somebody who has done brickwork for years and years. And this is the change I want for my daughter. This is not easy work. So this is the change that I want my daughter might have some point in her life. And I, naive as I was, I said, but you say that there are no opportunities. They said, so if they have no education, there's only one future that they have in store for them. If they do have education and if the stars are aligned, they might end up having an alternative future. And it is worth that future, working in the brick kilns in the heat of 40 degrees, it is worth that future, that one kind of shot, that one chance at life. So it's worth everything. And, it was quite powerful to see, how persistent they were in these ideas and how advanced these ideas were that they were talking about. And so then slowly and gradually, as I like spoke more with them, I heard their stories more, I started seeing these patterns, the ways in which they were literally forging pathways for themselves to make things happen for their daughters, for themselves. And the way that they were doing that was very neatly through, using a combination of voice and silence. Speak out certain times, be silent certain times, wait with patience, strategize, and then speak out when the time comes. So with that strategic kind of thinking, they were actually forging pathways through which they were sometimes then able to achieve more gains that they would otherwise. So that was an interesting finding that came out. But when we talk about silences, why silences? Because we know that there is a big struggle that women and have gone through to be able to be heard. For example, they've had to come out, they've had to protest so that they can speak back to power with force, and then they have gained a lot of things meanwhile. For example, the women's protests in 2019 in Chile, or the sort of women movements, or the African sort of the Black African feminist movements as well. And sometimes the Islamic feminist movements, although there's another then dimension of silences more than voice emerging there. But then we can say that, voice has its merits, and voice has been rightfully used to break out of oppression. But what the scholars who talk about or who develop this area of silences say is that yes, voice is important, but do not forget that it is essential for us as researchers to understand where we're sitting, where our position is, and to scrutinize what conditions are out there. So, for example, what is the economic condition of those women who are now coming out on the streets? What is the sort of, have they been a victim of historical neoliberalism, capitalism, of patriarchy, all sorts of things. But then at the same time, look at the cultural histories, the sort of the other dimensions, the gender relations that happen. And only after a scrutiny of all of those background and that context are we then able to accept these as ways of power or not. So what happens is that with silences too, a pledge to silences is to say that we believe in diversity of people's, women and men's experiences of oppression, which means that we believe that people are affected by oppression in different ways. And so in different ways do they speak back to power. Sometimes they have to walk out on the street to speak back to power and protest to gain certain ends. They come in numbers, they come in collectives in protection. Sometimes, in smaller spheres, it's more practical for them to work in different ways to speak back to power. For example, many women in cultures, they don't come in confrontation with their cultural or gendered norms. In fact, they adopt those norms, and then they silently use their own voice to kind of like strategize in that point. So as to say that as a pledge to the diversity of the experiences of people, gendered experiences of people, and their ability to sort of speak back to power, we accept that there are different ways that that is done in the world. And it will depend on the history of that country. It will depend on the history of that community, on the situation of that community. So, for example, Jane Papat sometimes uses a very simple example of a war zone. So, if you're a person in a war zone and you step out and you raise your voice, you'll literally be shot, wouldn't you? So, what do? To protect yourself, you strategize. You sometimes, you go under the shadows. You organize. Develop numbers, and then even if it is safe for you to come out and protest, you would. Otherwise, you would strategize from there, from the shadows, and you would work there. So there is no voice and no activism involved there. But does that mean that this is not power? This is not speaking back to sort of oppression and talking back to oppression. So promise is like, so kind of that as researchers that we make to say that, we're not going to be pledging to, silence or, voice, but we're going to be thinking about people and how people use these as instruments to gain those ends of power, basically. So, for example, there's the example of the Ubuntu kind of movement, or if you talk about the Chilean Silent March, or you talk about the silent vigils that people actually conduct to speak back to power in certain ways. And then more recently, the lighting up the walls that has been also happening in Colombia as well, because quite literally, it's the pandemic times. If you step out, you will increase the numbers of COVID cases, and this will be detrimental. But you speak out. How do you speak? You use other ways, other modalities to show that activism of yours. And there are many multiple examples of people doing that. Now, the particular kind of agency that emerges there, that is captured well by the work of Sabah Mahmood. So Sabah Mahmood actually talks about agency that is created in conditions where there's historic kind of subordination that has been happening. There are some cultures of silence where it is not the norm to kind of speak out or shout or kind of say things in a certain way. There are certain ways in which things are communicated and said. And she says that in these histories of subordination, they enable certain other modalities of agency to emerge. For example, in those ways, women might not be in conflict with their surroundings, but they may lay low, they may have their silences, strategize, and move in ways with the help of which, and they're the best judges being in that situation, to adopt methods through which they gain their sort of outcomes to the best ways that they would have liked. So I'm just going to now tell you a story before we just conclude. And this story and this picture is really symbolic. And I'm going to come back to this picture, but this picture is so this is the house of Bushra, the mother that I'm going to be talking about. And she and her family lives there now. But I just wanted us to go back to the lives of these women who live in these particular contexts. And I wanted to talk about Bushra particularly. So Bushra, when she got married, she moved into a rural community to start living with her in-laws in their family house. So when she moved there, unfortunately, her in-laws and her husband as well were quite abusive, and she had quite a hard time. But from what she told me, she never protested or anything, never said anything. And then her daughter Bilqis was born. After Bilqis, she had a few more children, but she saw that spark in Bilqis, and she said that ever since she started going to school, and the girl was very bright. When I met her, she was going to college at that point in time. So then Bushra tells me that she was very bright. She would always be on, she would be the top of the class, and she would do really well. And the mother was very proud of her daughter. And so when Bilqis, so there's the national kind of exam when you reach grade 5. And when Bilqis had this grade 5 exam, she actually topped the whole board, so which is a big thing. And there's hundreds of candidates there. And she topped it, and the mother was so proud. And she said, she's going to do big things. And she wanted to become a doctor, and had ever since childhood she wanted to become a doctor. But then, so Bushra told me that one day, so her husband actually lived in a different city because he worked there, and he used to come visit the family every now and then. And he said, she's growing up all that, and as soon as she's done with her grade 10, I think we should, we should stop sending her to school, because there's absolutely no opportunities here. Also, it would be better for her to probably get married. And so that is the time when I think we should draw the line. Now, Bushra tells me that was the point. And remember, this is the lady who's been living in an abusive kind of relationship for a very long time and has not protested. She said something clicked. And she said, I said to him that that's not going to happen. My daughter is very bright, and I can't do that to her. And he said, well, if you do not listen to me, then I'm not going to be supporting you financially at all. You'll be on your own, you and the daughter as well. So Bushra said that, I actually told him that, I'll be all right with that. When the time comes, we'll see. But it's a big thing for somebody who's never earned on her by herself. She stayed in the house. She's never actually been in the outside world. For a person like that, and she's never spoken out for whatever has happened to her in her life. So for such a person to say, no, I'm going to earn in whichever way, I'm going to make this happen. It was a big thing for her. So she says that I came back home, and she lived with that family with her sister, who had been married to her husband's brother. So both the sisters lived in the same in-law family house. And she said, so she had a bit of a camaraderie there, right? And she said that I spoke with my sister, and I said, and the sister had one son, and they said, this first daughter has to set an example, and we have to do something about it. And so they decided that they would start saving up money. so that they could actually, save up money enough so that they could invest that into the daughter's education. So she told me that once they were on a stroll and they met an old man, and he had a calf, and he said, I want to sell this calf, because, and she said that we wanted to buy, but we didn't have any money. And he said, that's fine, you can just take the cattle, and then you can pay me whenever you have the money. So the sisters brought the calf, took the calf to one of their friends, the neighbors, and requested her to keep it for them. And they started paying little bits of money for like the fodder and for the food of the calf and looking after the calf. And they secretly kept the cattle there. And so this is a time when their daughter is like growing up, and she's going into secondary, and she's now in year 7 and 8. And they slowly and gradually, the calf turned into a cow. They're earning a bit more money with the sort of other dairy products, the dairy that is coming out. And so they're saving this money. And not just that, they are now in contact with their brothers who live in their parental kind of rural community, where apparently there's a lot of schools availability. There's a lot of government schools, and there's also a college that's nearby. So very accessible access to schooling is available there. So they're speaking with their brothers secretly, and they asked their brothers to look for a piece of land that they could purchase on an affordable price. And so the brothers and they, kind of, kept that to themselves. And one fine morning, when they had the enough money and they had actually bought the piece of land, the sisters just, rounded everything up, took their children, and moved to this place. So fortunately, the husband was in the other city, but when he came later, now like he's completely all right with that. But the interesting bit is that this house that you see in the picture, this was just land. And they say we came in, and just with a few sort of like leaves and so a few leaves and kind of, we just made some shelter, and we started living there. And they said people used to make fun of us and say they're crazy, this is not safe where they're living, what are they doing? But they said they didn't know how it felt like to be free and to be able to achieve what you had in mind. So slowly and gradually they started, from 1 to 2 cattle, and they started growing. They had a boundary built, and then they had made a couple of quarters rooms. So one of them you can see in the picture, the one was on the left hand side towards the back, and on the right hand side they had like quite a few cattle tied, and there were, I think, 2 or 3 cows, some goats as well. And so they said to me, we can't feed fancy food to our children, but we have butter, we have milk, we have good grain, and we have bread, and we can trade the grain for something else, but we can feed them well. And the rest of the children were going to the state school where they didn't have to pay much because there was access, right? And all of the money that they were saving was being put into the education of this daughter. And the daughter, when I met her, she was doing really exceptionally well at college, and she might as well, if they had the resources, would actually go into a medical school. But having said this, it was really amazing how these women actually, how they, intentionally kept their silences to strategize, to work towards something else, keeping their targets very clear and open in their mind. And at the same time, there were moments where, for example, they broke out, they came out of the house and they showed their voice or their action and activism. But at the same time, there was a combination of things done right, silences being kept at the right time, strategies being made at the right time, at the right point, and then actions being done as well that led to this success. Now, this is one of the very successful.
I'm sorry that I'm interrupted, just like maybe 5 minutes.
Yes, this is the last slide. I'm sorry. So just the last slide. So basically, there were other cases where they didn't actually achieve this big sort of success. But at the same time, there were mothers who, when they talked about the little things that they did to provide, so there was a mother who did some things to provide education to her daughters, but they stopped going to school. But when she talked about the things that she did and the glimmer in her eyes when she talked about that, and the power that you saw in the ways that she told that story, told how she, in her way, spoke back to power. So just as researchers thinking about, how is it that people actually speak back to power in very different ways, whether it's by the use of silence or by voice. And just to end on the note that a lot of emphasis is now on moving away from just glorifying voices or glorifying silences, but to think about what is that liminal space, that in between space in which these concepts interact, and actually going back to the people, the women, the men, and thinking about how is it that they use these concepts together to then forge places for themselves, spaces in the world for themselves. And that's where the literature on silences is actually coming to now. Thank you very much. I took a lot of time, but I get carried away with my work. I'll be more than happy to take any questions.
No, Alia, thank you so much. Really, like, thank you. Really super interesting to know this, like, different perspective of understanding, like, education, also like in a different context that we used to. So we have some questions. I don't know, first of all, if some of my colleagues from the group want to express something. Otherwise, we can, okay. So I'm
No,
going
it
to read.
will maybe invite people to that. Now we will have this, I will say it in Spanish. Sorry, Aliya, but it's to invite people to. Ahorita la idea es que hay, bueno, hay unas personas que están en la traducción, pero bueno, nosotros que estamos aquí, la idea es que podamos hacerle todas las preguntas a ella sobre capabilities, educación, e inclusive creo que es Robinson quien nos está pidiendo como unas comparaciones entre Pakistán y basado en género y Colombia, pero entonces siéntanse libres. Realmente la doctora Aliya en serio es una de las académicas que personalmente me gusta mucho su trabajo y creo que es un honor tenerla acá y hay que aprovechar este momento para, pues para hacerle estas preguntas, inclusive en un contexto tan diferente, nos está trayendo ideas como el tema de interpretar silencios en métodos cualitativos. No sé a ustedes cómo les parece, si tienen alguna pregunta sobre eso. Así que cualquier pregunta, súper bienvenida y por favor anímense, inclusive hacerla en español hablando y ponen la cámara y alguno de nosotros traduce o como está haciendo Robinson a través del chat. Entonces, por favor, aprovechen el espacio.
I'm going to read like a question from Pedro Alfonso de la Puente. So he asks, how do women's individual aspirations relate or intersect with women's social expectations? Are women actively changing social expectations in Pakistan?
So like I said, so social transformation happens on many levels, right? There are levels, for example, in which, for example, the women's marches that have been happening in Pakistan, called the Aurat March, they've been quite controversial. They've, come out and they've had quite kind of, they have met a lot of resistance. But at the same time, at that level, women are coming out and they are protesting. But at the same time, for example, there was a case in 2018 where a woman was actually set on fire because she didn't heat up food or something. And so these women were marching on the streets, holding placards, talking about that incident. But obviously, these women within those families, we can't expect or have those expectations from them to put themselves into jeopardy and to walk out and protest. So which is why I think the individual aspirations and the concept of silences and the other ways lets us think about, thinking about transformation in different bite sizes as well as the big ones. So in bite sizes, how do women actually might not come in confrontation with their families because they exist in that space, right, in that culture. But at the same time, in their different ways, they do push back on power. How do they protest? What methods do they use? That's a different story. But I would definitely say social transformation is happening, but sometimes in bite sizes, sometimes in big efforts.
We have another question here. How to encourage feminine, how do you say liderazgo?
Like raising voices and leadership?
The leadership, exactly. The leadership from women and raising their voices in the context of sustitución, Isa.
Illicit crop substitution. Like, just to contextualize you, Aliya, a little bit, in Colombia, we have the situation of the cultivation of coca crops, which are determined to be illegal by the government. So after the peace agreement, we are in the context of alternative development programs, but we believe some of the people and the people in the field are in the middle of an external battle, and especially women are in the middle of this. So I think Diana it has a very interesting question about how can we like strengthen these kind of leaderships of these voices that that are in the territories.
So I mean, I don't know about the Colombian context that much, but for example, that just makes me think about one of the some of the sort of indigenous and some of the local women's movements that are happening in Pakistan as well. For example, there's a movement called the Thapa Brigade. So actually, when there was police brutality in some of the regions, and they used to take the youngsters, their sons and men away, they started this baton kind of thing that is used to wash clothes, right? And the women started coming out with those as symbols of, you know, we're going to come out and we're going to fight, and they wouldn't let them enter those territories. So little, I would say that not on the level of, again, you know, women work in different kinds of spheres. Sometimes it's within the family, into pushing back to expectations and gendered norms. Other times they collect together in the shape of, let's say, local movements and come out. There's this Chipko movement in India, where women actually, when they were cutting down forests, and they were forest communities, and a lot of sort of these forestry is becoming feminized because men are migrating into the cities. So these women, to protect their trees, they would hug the trees. They would not let people cut them. So suddenly when they would see machines coming by, they would just stick to the trees. So there are pockets of kind of you know, protest that is happening in those certain ways. But sometimes, you know, it appears to me that a lot of times activism and women's voices and their fighting and the pushing back on power happens in different kinds of concentric circles and spheres. For example, in the parliament, there would be people talking about certain things. Through the legal system, there would be other things that lawyers would be doing. There would be women within the households doing their sort of thing. Then the local kind of Thapa Brigade and the Chipko movement kind of, you know, initiatives also taking place there. But, you know, there doesn't seem to be a connection, like a cutting across that happens between them. But at the same time, what I have seen from my own kind of context is that a social kind of transformation starts happening. It is a cue, like that transformation kind of trickles down to the society in one way or another. So for example, a good example that I give is that of Malala Yousafzai. So when she got shot and all of those events happened, even though there's a lot of controversies around, you know, how is the international, for example, world making use of, you know, that symbol of education. But at the same time, and you couldn't actually make sort of a statistical analysis of that and say there is a relationship between that. But actually, a few years down the line in Swat, the place where Malala was from, there's a sort of a jirga system, which is like the informal legal kind of system, where if something goes wrong, the elders come together and they decide upon a matter. And the jirga used to be mostly a male dominated kind of area. And a few years down the line, we have female jirgas in Swat. And in a lot of places, the male jirgas invite the female, you know, participants to, you know, preside on some of those jirgas as well. So I'm often thinking that, you know, although they seem disconnected, but at the same time, transformation happens everywhere in different, whether it's in small pockets or it's like in the shape of movements, massive movements. And I think there's value, ethical value, that we should be placing on all those kinds of pockets.
Thank you,
Thank
Doctor.
you, Aliya. So just to complement and drawing upon the presentation that you just did, is also a matter of acknowledging the strategies that women already take and do in their own communities. And there are a lot of things going on in everything, but specifically also in this a specific context of coca crop substitution, for example. So there are always women and people doing grassroots movements, grassroots things, and acknowledging those strategies and maybe amplifying those voices and connected the tissues between those different areas that you highlighted, these different levels of hierarchy. So I think that
Isa, can I also add something here? Also, the fact that to understand that there's no hierarchy between them. If you are able to raise your voice, go out in the street in the protection of hundreds of others, you are privileged, and you might have to struggle very hard to be in that position. But yet, there is no hierarchy between what the women are doing in, you know, looking after the crops and everything, and what women who are stepping out on the streets doing. There isn't a hierarchy. It's a sort of a struggle that happens alongside each other, and that's how we support each other best. So I think that is also very important to understand that there's value, equal value in every kind of resistance and speaking back to power. Not just women, but also men. So for example, men who do not abide by the normal sort of toxic masculinist expectations, and they're also in the society, they also find it very hard to fit. So, voices of others as well besides women.
I just like have to say that I found super powerful that different non-binary idea of silence. Like for me, it was super transformative because I think that we are used to think exactly that. As you said, with being like a woman have been silenced, and we tend to relate to that, but also when they can actually like plan strategies through their own silences, and this like all the cases that you like present in your research are super interesting, how sometimes even they just like decide to keep silent, and then they decide just like to talk and yeah, make sure that they are heard. Just before like give the word to Camila, I would like continue this topic, but I would like you to tell us a little bit more about how you actually relate like this silence with actually the adaptive preference of sense. Like in one part, like for me was like I never like considered that, so maybe I would like you to tell us a little bit more.
Yeah. So adaptive preferences, I think the idea of silences is actually the antithetical to adaptive preferences, because what we're saying through the idea of silences and negative capability, which is another construct that I work with, is the fact that people live in certain circumstances and they're habituated by those circumstances. But it is important for us to consider that they remain people who can think and who have the ability to kind of speak back to power. And we should not take that dignity away from the people to consider them as objects and say that this person has lived in misery for so long that they have become the underdog. So not, those ideas, but in a way, in speaking this, what we're thinking about is where is power in that process? Is from the perspective of the person power emerging there? And then how is it that we as researchers actually make account of that? And like I said, oftentimes when I looked and I talked to these mothers, their efforts and their aspirations did not lead them to have this successful story that Bushra had. But at the same time, the twinkle in their eyes, the excitement, the sort of giggles that they had when they talked about that showed me that they sought power. That was their way of speaking back. So I think it is kind of the opposite of adaptive preferences in the sense that you are then again fighting for that dignity of that woman, and you're saying that even though she's living in these conditions, she might have been habituated in these conditions, but we cannot imagine for 1 minute that this is an object that has stopped thinking, and there's nothing happening in that brain of hers. So we always give that pride, that credit, that dignity to that person to think. And a lot of this has parallels with Islamic feminism as well. And especially the burqa ban, the hijab ban that happened in France and the debates around that. To think that, we can't decide for, just for context, though, the government of France actually put a ban on wearing hijabs in France, and girls couldn't, wear that at school. And actually the issue was that we're liberating them from these practices that hold them down. So then again, what about that person? And women have come out to say, they wear hijabs for multiple reasons, for identity, for their own subjectivity, for, psychological comfort, protection, for cultural validation, all multiple reasons. Where is the voice of that woman in here when you're making those judgments? Similarly, when we take only voice to be one measure of power, where is there space for those women to speak out? As researchers, we are closed. Like we are thinking, you are raising a voice, you are powerful, you're not raising a voice, get on one side, because you have been adapted to this kind of situation. And so you are literally an object. So it's kind of the opposite of that in one way.
Sorry to interrupt, and I apologize, Robinson, because you wrote a question and we didn't read it. But so Robinson has a question more about context, and he wants to know from you. He's really curious about how is the topic on violence and gender violence in Pakistan, and how is like the parity and equity thing is in Pakistan, because I mean he's trying to make a question related to comparing Colombia and Pakistan, but yeah, it's just only on the Pakistan side, please, if you could tell us more about it, about the context on violence and job market as well. He's asking also about salaries and employment. So if you can give us more a bit of context. And then Carol, she has the hand raised. And then we can finish with the Rodrigo's question if anyone else is having a question. So yeah, so please, Doctor.
Okay. So when I came to Cambridge, like I would always be asked, you come from a place where, oh, women are this, and I accept that women are facing a lot of issues, and that's something that we are speaking out about sometimes, in our own ways. But then I realized that, this situation is true for all over the world. Like no nation has reached, we still have gender pay gaps in the most of the developed kind of economies, and we have similar problems, but their shapes and forms are different, right? So for example, for a country that really struggles with economic resources, the struggles would be a little bit different. Patriarchy would still be there, but it's a very normal kind of construct. So in that sense, I'm thinking, yes, there is gender parity issues, although that basically means literally in the way the complex world works, especially when we talk about gender and patriarchy, gender parity becomes a very superficial or a very surface level thing to think about. It doesn't mean anything when I say that for every boy there are 4 girls that are out of school. Actually, these measures, these comparisons don't mean a lot, because because at the end of the day, what are the girls gaining from that school? What are the experiences? How is the society enabling or disabling their journeys towards these fields? So for example, I relate that a little bit similar to the STEM education and the lack of women in STEM education in the rest of even the northern world, basically. And so what happens is that just by improving the allocations of seats in the math department for girls is not going to solve anything. There will be no girls who will actually fill those positions, because structures don't allow. These spaces are exclusionary. They exclude women for these spaces. And so similarly, in a similar way, in Pakistan too, there are issues. Like I said, access to school is very low for girls. But then again, why is this not being solved? Okay, there are other political issues as well. For example, the active destruction of girls' schools in Pakistan after the militant kind of attacks, etc. on it. But at the same time, it's a chronic problem. It's a big problem that's not being solved. So there are many multiple other issues. For example, violence. Just like many other countries in the world, there is violence. There is also talk about pushing back on violence. For example, these Women's Day marches, the main key idea of the marches was that they picked up on each and every case that happened and they spoke out against it, right? There are a number of lawyers, female lawyers in Pakistan, who are constantly working to improve the legal system, so there was there was this one rule that was brought in by a military government in which was very regressive. So they needed support from the religious circles, and so the women became the sort of they always come into the light as the ways in which these things are negotiated. So what happened? More regressive policies for women. One of these policies was about rape victims, and actually if women could not prove rape, they could be tried for adultery. And there was a big sort of outcry then. There was nearly in the 70s, and actually you had to produce witnesses to say that they had seen that this was a rape. And when does that happen, right? So what happened was, for the first time in the history of Pakistan, in the military kind of time, the political parties weren't allowed to come out on the streets. Women came out in massive numbers, and they protested, and they were out on the streets, and the other groups started coming out. And that kind of thing has prevailed. It has happened in different points in time in Pakistan, continues to be, but the problems are still there. But personally, I'm seeing more of a social media kind of coverage of these issues, a talking back of these issues that is happening now. So there is hope, but at the same time, it's as bad as it is in many parts of the world. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you. Carol?
Thank you. Hello, are you watching me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Okay, have you think to extend your research, excuse me, to analyze the effects of fathers in education and to development of capabilities and complement with it your analysis about mothers? That's one of the questions. The second is, how do you think that analysis of silence can be turned into a quantitative analysis, or do you think that it is feasible? And finally, could you give us any advice to develop that kind of research in our context? Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Carol. These are wonderful questions. I'll try to do justice to them. I don't give answers, I just give more reflections. But fathers, yes, absolutely. So for me, particularly, because my framing was around how mothers and their efforts were contextualized in a very human capital light in the literature. And then was literature to show that there were strong relationships emotionally between the mother and the daughter because of the shared experience of gendered experiences amongst them, that I focused on the mothers, but at the same time I spoke with the fathers, and I also had their kind of opinions, and I've got their reflection. But the fathers information was actually used to contextualize the stories of the mothers and the daughters, so trying to gain more. So in a way, my focus was the mother and the daughter relationship, but in the background they were the father, the other elderly in the house that had more position in decision making, or the brothers, their experiences, and other family members as well. But my focus wasn't on the fathers. But I know of colleagues whose research is totally focused on fathers, and their research is focused on masculinities basically, so they take the other angle of the approach to see, how that can happen. And I don't know if I got the question about silences right, but if I understood this, you were talking about the methodological use of silences in research. Was that, Carol, your question?
Yes.
Okay, so silences, again, like I said, silences are meant not for the participant, they're meant for us as frame of understanding, us as researchers, as people engaged in development, people thinking about development. It is for us to look back on ourselves, and I've recently written a paper on that, to question ourselves and be reflexive and say, who am I in this research? Am I a white scholar trying to research the efforts of women in, let's say, Central Africa? Am I, what is my positionality? Who am I in this research process? And then silence is a message. And so it's a lesson for us. It's a reminder for us to say that we cannot stick by what we read in the northern sort of canons of knowledge. So because you see, knowledge is very politically curated, because knowledge is only, there are publishing houses that publish certain research that becomes powerful in the rest of the world. And because we have access to only this knowledge is the way that we see knowledge emerging here, right? So then it is a call to ourselves and our reflexivity as researchers to say, okay, what I'm reading through Eric, Google Scholar, this and that, this is just the work that has politically come out to be seen as knowledge. But I don't have to promise myself, and I don't have to promise my allegiance to just this knowledge. I have to remain open and stay true to my participants as much as I can, and try to understand their efforts and see how is it that they're feeling. And there could be cues, there could be that sparkle in the eye, there could be that excitement, there could be that redness on the face, there could be that telling of a story in a certain way that we can capture from that experience, that interaction with those people. And so it is for us, the lesson of silence is for us to say that, we have known that voice is the only way to show power. But what if that's not the case? Because what we know is only what has been politically curated and given to us as knowledge to begin with, right? Do you see from Central Africa, very few, there will be publishing houses, or from Peshawar, my city, there wouldn't be any publishing houses. There's no scene there. So all of the work that, it doesn't mean that the people living in those places are not intelligent and they're not producing valuable work. They're in the field, they're producing the most valuable work in development at the moment. But because of politics, their literature doesn't come to that level, right? Could be because of the language, they don't speak the sort of politically strong language English, or there could be other multiple reasons. But silences is a call to us as researchers, and not for people. We don't make those judgments, to remain open to new ways of understanding what people are doing. And sorry, the third one was, I missed that question, Carol.
The third one was about could you give us any
Camilla and I wanted to use negative.
Ah, yeah, sure. Corporación, Rosa, se me está olvidando el nombre. Rosa Blanca es la corporación
De
que,
la FARC.
que es un poco polémica porque es de víctimas de las FARC y las han puesto inclusive en una posición bastante como se han opuesto a las FARC y han tenido muchas críticas al proceso, han entrado en una posición muy polémica. So I just telling people about the Corporación Rosa Blanca because it's really, I told you that it's really polemic in the sense that we are in the middle of the peace process and they appear and they are against the peace process. So it's really weird. They have been like approached politically, but they are still victims. So it's a really interesting topic. Yeah.
So actually, so because a part of these conversations also go into the realm of negative capability, which means, how do people act in extreme kind of constraints? And how do women, what decisions they take? And sometimes they're just like, you're mind blown. Why are they saying this? Doesn't make sense. But why? How is this happening? So just to sort of frame it like, the context, again, thinking about, really scrutinizing the context. Why is it that this is happening? What is the history behind that? What are the reasons? What are the experiences of these people? What are the cultural what are their experiences with the normal kind of political bodies out there in the country? And what has that, made them to actually do? So I think in the context of the way that I see Latin America, there is a lot of like activism, and which is much needed. You have to come out on the streets, and there's more protection there, in a sense, not protection in the sense that they also have to face brutality, military brutality, and everything on the streets. But at the same time, I see there's a lot of activism of that kind, and there it's like a wave, right? So there's some protection in some norms and some waves. But at the same time, I think silences are more effective in trying to understand, and not just silences. When I say silences, I don't mean an allegiance to silence instead of voice and to pitch both of them against each other, but actually to say, what are the other ways? Why are people doing what they're doing? Why are they saying certain things? So kind of scrutinizing and remaining open to, okay, we read the literature, we know the news, but things are happening in a very unexpected way. Why is that happening? So investigating more, understanding when people kind of suppress certain ways, when they say certain ways in a certain way, what are the strategies going on in between? So I think, lying low and kind of like looking and observing intently, critical reflection, critical kind of engagement, and trying to understand what is happening, that in a way can help us to understand, what else is happening. If they're going against what everybody would be wanting at this moment, what makes them say this? What is happening here?
Thank you.
Okay, and just to finish, because we are running out of time and we are sorry because we would like to ask you so many questions. So there is a question written by Rodrigo, and he is asking how we can wait, ¿cómo podemos proponer a la sociedad que se exija a los gobiernos una formación de liderazgo para que la mujer actúe? Yeah, so he's asking how we as society, how we can like start organizing ourselves in order to demand to governments education and training for women in order to them to get education. I don't know if I'm understanding quite well the question, but yeah, he's asking like how we can make the government to work on women's education and training, this in order to get more education for women.
So that's a very interesting question. And so I think like everybody in the rest of the world who's struggling with women's issues is thinking about the same thing. But I think we have to understand that capitalism, patriarchy, and colonialism and many other forms, they are, and especially, capitalism and now gender and patriarchy, they're intermingling to form different ways in which societies are being organized now. And so, they're quite entrenched in the systems. And if you have to fight against the capitalist system, then again with the gendered element to it. And from what I see, and I mean, like I said, I may not be so informed, but the pockets of activism and the ways of protest that I see happening in Latin America at the moment, I think it's a wave that is happening, right? I mean, the Arab Spring happened just in one part of that area, and then it took over the rest of the world. So, I mean, in my mind, you are doing at best that you can do, and I see a lot of activism happening there. But perhaps for people who are now, in the positions that you are, understanding the whole politics, perhaps being a little more active could be the demand of the time. But it really depends on, and then again, it's a trade-off between the safety, security, and at the same time, looking at what ends are you trying to meet and how much pressure do you want to create, and being as safe as you can as a group as well. So it's a tricky question, and I don't think I have an answer to it. But yeah, in little bits and pockets, that activism, that coming out, that should put pressure on the governments. But if the governments are relying on a capitalist global system, then I don't know how much of a motivation they would have to actually listen to these demands. And that's the key issue. But that doesn't mean that the activism that people do means nothing. It does mean anything. There's a drop in that ocean that then again, makes that difference, because then it blows up and it becomes and sometimes quite unexpectedly governments have to they have to listen to their people. But at the same time, I think activism is probably the key for the kind of world that we're living in.
Thank you, Dr. Ivo.
No, I was going to say, actually, I'm going to give you, Cami, the word in the end. But no, thank you, Dr. Aliya, for your time, for sharing with us all of this knowledge. As Camila said before, there are many, many more questions that we would like to do. We hope maybe we can have a next webinar with you later, but yeah, maybe to develop a little bit more the interesting, what also I found very interesting, how mothers could also develop capabilities pursuing that aspiration for their daughter's education, and maybe a little bit more in what you were saying about negative capabilities as well, which is a very new also concept for us. But thank you so much also for your time, for answering the questions, and for sharing this really important and valuable knowledge with us. So, Cami.
Can I just say 2 sentences? I just wanted to thank you all for the brilliant questions. I think with every question answered is a new learning experience. And I've learned so much just being in this space. And again, it's a privilege to be between all of you, be sitting here with all of the brilliant people. Thank you. Just wanted to say that. I've learned.
Thank you, Aliya. No, I just want to say some of the main conclusions for us. I think that most of us, we are economists, and I will say it in Spanish, pero creo que como de las enseñanzas es ella, creo que Aliya nos mostró cómo el rol de la teoría de capabilities nos da un enfoque metodológico para entender los procesos, cosa que la teoría, por ejemplo, de capital humano que nos enseñan no lo hace. Creo que lo otro que es muy importante es que el proceso realmente es muy importante, porque tenemos que entrar a analizar nuestra posicionalidad como investigadores, entender que es nuestra responsabilidad aprender a escuchar inclusive los silencios y a entender qué significan, que eso es algo que a veces en la metodología cuantitativa y en el estar a veces muy metido en una metodología en particular y en no entender realmente la pregunta, pues de eso adolecemos muchas veces. Entonces creo que son como 2 cosas para rescatar: la capabilities, lo que nos permite las reflexiones sobre el género, sobre la libertad. One point that you made, and is the difference between the human capital theory and the, how rich is the capabilities theory, in terms that makes you to understand the process, to see other complexities that usually you don't see when you are really seeing the capital and the outcome, the input and output, and you don't understand what is going on there. So thank you very much, Doctor. We love you having you here, and thanks for your time. And yeah.
Please feel free to send me any questions if